crazy image that I made yesterday, but just trying to kind of make it easy for everyone perhaps to understand what we're talking about when we're talking about copyright in relation to TDM and AI. Of course, I mean the evolution, the rapid evolution of AI models and the usage of text and data mining in research science, universities, and in the business sector is very comprehensive. But if you boil it down to what it actually is from a copyright perspective, I think it's very typical to talk about it in terms of the input part and the output part. And then in the middle, you have this big, scary, crazy thing that is TDM and artificial intelligence. So what you typically do, of course, is that you have something that you train a model with, be it by using NLPs or large language models or I don't know what not. So you would need to have some kind of text corpus or a set of images or media files or voices or data and so on and so on. So on the one hand, you have the copyright relevant questions on what you train the models with. That can take many different forms. Some of it might be works that reach the so-called threshold of originality that I will come back to a bit later, whereas some of them might, as in the case of data, not be copyrightable at all. And then on the other hand, on the other side, when you have trained your AI model or you used TDM for the purpose that you want, then you might get an output that might look like, or that might be in the form of new text. I suppose a few of you might have used ChatGPT or similar tools to improve, to change, to adapt texts. You might have images as an output, voice as an output, decisions, suggestions. Of course, these can take very many different forms. But the copyright-related questions when it comes to output, in my understanding, or as far as I've looked into it, is slightly easier than the input question. I think that the existing copyright laws on an EU and national level are flexible enough to be able to handle the output side. And I'll very quickly run through kind of copyright related questions to the output, like end of the AI sphere, before I delve deeper into the input end, which I think is harder and perhaps more interesting from a copyright and legal point of view. So why do I think that it's slightly easy or easier to talk about, or to solve the issues that we know exist with AI and text and data mining from an output perspective? For the first thing is that when it comes to output, it's much harder for any involved actor to actually make any copyright claim. Most European and international court cases on these issues and related issues clarify that copyright can only be claimed by humans in the first place. And perhaps the most famous example of this principle is the monkey selfie, which some of you might be aware of since previously. And in this case, a photographer left his camera close to this monkey individual, and the monkey itself started to play around with the camera and took these, in my view, quite wonderful selfies, smiling. I don't know if this monkey species can smile, but it looks like at least the individual is smiling. So the photographer initially claimed copyright to these photos, but courts in the United States judged that the monkey took the photos and not the photographer, because it was the monkey that actually pushed the button on the camera. So even though the photographer had done post-production, etc., that was not enough for the photographer to be able to claim copyright on these photos. And as copyright in itself is centered around humans, a monkey cannot claim copyright. So according to the US court, this photo is in the public domain. And a similar court case that also revolves around the usage of cameras as a technical tool, like the intersection between man and technology, between like creating something yourself and creating something together with the technical tool, is court case from the Court of Justice of the European Union from 2011, which is commonly called the Pioneer case, because it was filed by woman called Eva Pajner. And I think that this Pajner case from 2011 will probably be quite important in EU law or in EU court cases when it comes to interpreting copyright to AI output. So this case also concerned photos and cameras, and especially portrait photos from a school journal that was used in the search for Natasha Kampusch, who was, as you might recall, abducted and kidnapped for many years. But these photos of Natasha Kampusch were, after Natasha Kampusch was released, used by several large German media outlets without attributing the photographer Eva Pajner. So this court case established and harmonized several important notions in the EU. Among those, what I mentioned, the threshold of originality, like how creative, how much creativity does it need to be in something that is created for it to be considered a work and thus copyrightable. So the conclusion is that pushing a button on a camera is usually not enough for copyrights. And actually, the Pajner case goes quite far in establishing what is needed to claim copyrights. So this involves both the preparatory phase, the execution phase, and the post-production phase. So while a photo in itself might not yield copyrights, it might do so if the photographer has done lots of preparations and improved the photo or the series of photos after the shot. And why do I talk about the monkey selfies and the photos and Natasha Kampusch when we're supposed to talk about text and data mining and artificial intelligence? Well, I think that the analogy is quite strong here between the camera and the AI model. These are both two technical aids that pose the question of what the creator need to have done extra in order to be able to claim copyright on a work. I think that with the Pajner case in mind, especially in EU case law, the existing legislation and court cases from the CJEU, the Court of Justice of the European Union, are enough in order to be able to deal with the output question when it comes to copyright and artificial intelligence. So I think that the most important and relevant part, and what I will focus on during the duration of this presentation, is the input end. So let me go over to inputs. And in this presentation, I will first present a very short background, explain the existing provisions that we have in Swedish copyright law as well since 1st of January 2023, some of the problems that I see with the existing TDM provisions, text and data mining provisions, and also mention briefly the new proposals in the public inquiry that I was a part of and that was handed over to the Ministry of Justice on 19th of January, I think, this year. Also spend a few moments to discuss the problems that I see with the new proposals. Of course, this is not finalized yet, and all actors in Sweden have until 27th of May to provide written input on the proposals in this public inquiry. But I will mention a few of the problems that I see, and then I find it difficult to talk about AI in this period of time without mentioning the AI Act. So I will very briefly mention the copyright relevant provisions in the AI Act. But before I start to delve into the subject matter at hand, perhaps it's just given that we might have different amount of previous knowledge and of the kind of legal framework that exists around this area, I just like very briefly to mention like what our possibilities are in terms of writing law on copyright laws that relate to artificial intelligence and text and data mining. So when it comes to writing law, or when it comes to national implementations of law in the European Union, there are two directives that are very important when it comes to text and data mining and similar methods. One of them is the exceptions catalog of the InfoSoc directive. So the InfoSoc directive was the first attempt in the European Union to harmonize copyright law in the new and evolving information society. And this InfoSoc directive includes an exhaustive list of all the exceptions and limitations that you are allowed to implement on a national level. So if an exception to copyright doesn't exist in the InfoSoc directive and in any later EU directives, then you're not allowed to have it in a national law. So when you're writing national law, like for example in Sweden, then you're very much bound to what actually exists in this InfoSoc directive. There are about 20 different exceptions that are listed in this exceptions catalog, this exhaustive exceptions catalog. But of course, things have happened in society since the early 2000s when the InfoSoc directive was adopted. And there are a few new exceptions that have been adopted at the EU level, and that thus we need to implement at the national level. And among these, we have the two mandatory TDM exceptions, text and data mining exceptions, that came with the 2019 CDSM, or Copyright in the Digital Single Market Directive. And it's those two mandatory TDM exceptions from the CDSM directive that I will focus on mainly during this presentation. First, just two random figures that might say nothing to you at this point. I think that they are quite interesting. These two figures, or these two numbers, show at the top the amount of AI relevant provisions in the mentioned CDSM Act, the Copyright in the Digital Single Market Directive. And at the bottom, we see the amount of copyright relevant provisions in the AI Act that is currently, as you know, being discussed in the Council of the European Union and might be adopted later during this spring. So I will try to find time to mention a few things, as I said, on the AI Act. But as you can see from this, I think that the CDSM directive, or the Copyright and the Digital Single Market Directive, is the important EU directive when it comes to copyright for artificial intelligence. And I mentioned that we have two different provisions now in EU law, and also implemented in all national jurisdictions in the European Union when it comes to text and data mining. But the first thing that I want to shed light on is the EU CDSM definition on what text and data mining actually is. I think that the Swedish translation of this definition in Article 2.2 in the CDSM directive makes quite a bad job, because it takes away the any that I made in bold and italics from the English version. And I think that the any is very important here, because what this says is that text and data mining can be any automated analytical technique. It's not one kind or two kinds. It can be any kind of automated analytical technique that is used to analyze text and data. And if you see the other bold and italic text in the same paragraph, it includes, but it's not limited to, patterns, trends, and correlations. And to me, this is a very broad and open-ended definition, unusually open-ended for being EU law, which is typically quite precise. And I know that there's quite a lot of representatives of rights holders that are trying to argue that TDM and artificial intelligence is not the same thing, and that special licenses should apply, especially for the new and evolving large general purpose AI models. But when I read this definition, I think that it's quite clear that this is not the case. That the definition of text and data mining in Article 2.2 in the CDSM directive is broad enough to cover also the usage that we see emerging now. And this has, of course, also been established by the EU Commissioner Thierry Breton in a response to a written question from the European Parliament. And the view by Commissioner Breton is that the TDM provisions in the Copyright and the Digital Single Market Directive should be enough to cover the growth of general purpose AI models, and that no revisions of the TDM provisions, text and data mining provisions, are needed to deal with the input question. And I must agree that I actually agree with Thierry Breton in this case. So this is the definition at hand. This is what we are talking about when we are talking about text and data mining. But let's go over to the two exceptions that we actually now have in EU law and also in national law for working with text and data mining. So as you might recall, there are two different provisions for text and data mining from the Copyright in the Digital Single Market Directive. One for research purposes and one for industrial purposes or general purposes for anyone to use. And in the Swedish Copyright Act, these are implemented as paragraph 15A and 15B, with some common definitions laid out in 15C. And the first exception, the exception for research purposes, gives the right to research organizations and cultural heritage institutions to reproduce works for text and data mining for scientific purposes. So for the parties covered by the exception, it is very broad. There are no restrictions on what scientific purposes it can be used for, and researchers have the right to bypass technical protection measures and digital rights management, such as paywalls, to gain access to the material. But it can, of course, only be used by researchers connected to cultural heritage institutions or research organizations. And in this way, it's very restricted. And another important note that I will come back to briefly later is that it only entails the right to reproduce, to make copies. It involves no right to communicate to the public, or in the most restrictive interpretation, not even to colleagues within the same research groups. So a research organization has the right to make a copy of a book, for example, for TDM purposes. But it is very unclear from EU law what right the research organization has to do, or what the research organization can actually do with this copy in terms of sharing it, for example, with researchers. So this is what the TDM exception for research purposes looks like. And if we quickly go over to the general TDM exception, it's much wider in terms of who can make use of it. There are actually no restrictions at all on who can use this TDM exception. Anyone can make use of the general text and data mining exception. But this comes with a large but. Users can only use works where rights holders have not chosen to opt out in an appropriate manner. So this would mean that if a rights holder in an appropriate manner, in a way that it's easy to discover, says that you cannot use my works for this purpose, then the developer of this TDM model needs to respect that. And currently across Europe, many collective management organizations and rights holder representatives are starting to opt out on a general level. And I saw, for example, that the Association for Authors of Educational Material, I don't know what the formal name is in English, but they stated the general opt-out the other week, and others are expected to follow suit or intend to. And this means, of course, that there might be very little material in the end that can be used for this general TDM exception. One important thing to mention in regard to this, though, is that the directive and the Swedish legal commentary explicitly states that companies or civil society organizations can join research projects, and in those cases make use of the TDM exception for research purposes. So a company can be a part of a large research project which involves text and data mining, and then apply the Article 3 of the CDSM directive with the TDM exception for research purposes. But this is only in the cases where the research organization is the main party to the project, and if companies that are involved don't have priority to the output from the research. So these are the two exceptions and limitations in the Swedish Copyright Act that we currently have. Are there any issues with the existing provisions? I would say yes. So to reiterate a few of the issues that I see with the TDM provisions that we now have in EU and national law, then the first one would be that it involves no communication to the public, what I stated as a CTTP in the list that you might see on the screen. So it includes no communication to the public, only the act of copying. In most cases, of course, a research group, for example, would not be a public. But what happens if we see a large European research project, including several, maybe tens or dozens of universities where researchers come and go during the duration of the project. Would you then be allowed to share material for TDM with your colleagues, with other fellows in the same research project? So when does the research group become a public? Communication to the public, which is the important phrase or concept in this regard, is not yet an EU harmonized concept. So we don't know what this means in EU case law, which makes this a very blurry and potentially dangerous line. There are also several questions raised as to what lawful access means. So you can only use text and data mining on works to which you have lawful access. Lawful here means that you can use the works either based in law or an agreement or a license with a rights holder. So lawful includes both that you have the legal right, but also that you can, for example, sign a license with a rights holder. The recitals in the EU CDSM directive explicitly state, for example, that this involves material on the internet. So you can do, for example, web scraping for the purpose of text and data mining. But does that only cover material that is legally available on the internet? Or are you, as a user of text and data mining, obliged to know or find out whether material exists legally on the internet or not? Of course, as you know, it's not always the easiest thing to find out if material on the internet is legally available or not. So while the recital stating that you can use, for example, material on the internet is good in terms of making it easy for TDM users to get enough data to be able to develop good models, the lawful access part here is quite vague in terms of what is actually included, and lawful access is another concept that is not yet harmonized on an EU level. There are a few other issues that I see in the existing provisions. There are no there is no possibility included in the provisions to remote usage for universities. Sorry. So in most cases, you would have to travel physically to a research organization or a cultural heritage institution and take part of the work there. And of course, as we know, that researchers might be spread out, people might be, working in all different parts of Europe or the world. This requirement on having to go physically to the institution that has the works can be very cumbersome. And in the Swedish legal commentary, they say that it should be possible for rights holders and cultural heritage institutions and research organizations to come to an agreement here and develop the methods by themselves. But there is, I think, not enough legal pressure for this issue to be solved. And that also opens up for a large unclarity on cross-border usage. So the CDSM directive was intended to make it easier to work with material, to use works across borders in the European Union. And for that purpose, for example, the new education exception includes what they call a legal fiction, establishing that works that are used for education are used in the country where the educational institution is based. But there is no such legal fiction involved in the TDM provisions. So while the EU directive says that one of the purposes is to promote cross-border research within the European Union, there is very little wording in the actual TDM provisions that kind of support this cross-border usage. It's also unclear how long the copies can actually be stored. It says in the EU directive that you are allowed to store the copies for as long as it is needed for the purpose that you have used it for the research purposes, for example. Whereas the Swedish implementation turned this into a negative, phrasing that you're not allowed to store the copies for longer than is needed for the scientific purpose that you intend to use the material for. But of course, it can be very different from different projects, different research projects, for example. the duration of the time for which storing copies might be needed. I mean, in some research projects, I know there was a great issue with a psychological research project recently where you wanted to go back and verify material from decades ago. And that is, of course, only possible if you have actually been able to store the copies or store the data, store the information used for the research for a long period of time. So this is also unclear for how long you can actually store the copies that you have used for text and data mining. And again, as I mentioned previously, it's also quite unclear what the usage looks like on commercial use. And I think that this is a problem also because of the strong emphasis that the European Union puts in many of its research strategies on public-private partnerships and research, on collaboration between university sectors and business sectors. So there's a strong push from the EU to kind of see more collaboration between universities and companies. But the copyright provisions in this case is a direct obstacle, I'd say, to this priority from the European Union research strategies. So these are a few of the issues that I see with the existing provisions. To solve at least a few of these issues, there are a few proposals in the public inquiry report that I mentioned that was handed over to the Ministry of Law a few months ago. So there is a new exception that is proposed for communication to the public for scientific use. I'll mention a few words on this later. There are also a few changes that I think that I don't have time to go through. So if anyone is interested to learn more about those, I'm happy to talk about that afterwards. This public inquiry also mentions artificial intelligence, but clarifies that it is too soon to introduce new exceptions for artificial intelligence at this point in time. And I totally agree with that. When the public inquiry was appointed in 2022, then we had, of course, a completely different conversation around AI and copyright than we have today. So the new exception that is proposed in Swedish law to kind of solve a few of the issues that we see, or that has been seen with the TDM provisions, is the proposed exception 15D. It opens up for communication to the public for two specific reasons. So you are allowed to share material for TDM purposes if it is to fellow researchers in a scientific research project and for the verification of data. I don't think that this solves all of the issues, but I think that it might perhaps solve a few issues, and at least it clarifies to researchers and research organizations that it's completely fine within the research project to share material freely between the researchers, which I think is fundamental for academic freedom to actually work and for good science to be developed. It again reiterates this perhaps complicated sentence that the copies cannot be kept longer than what is necessary for the purpose and not be used for other purposes. This is, of course, in Swedish on the screen, but it's the text in bold that I'm mentioning, and I think that it's problematic that the Swedish legislator has opted for this kind of negative phrasing where you say that it cannot be kept longer rather than the positive phrasing that is in the original EU directive. So whereas according to the EU directive, you could imagine that material that is reproduced could be stored for eternity if it is needed for the purpose, then there is in the Swedish law, in my understanding, a definite ending for when you need to destroy the material. And of course, that can be problematic if a researcher needs in 20 years' time to go back and look into research that was done today and cannot find the material that was actually used in order to develop the material. So I think that there is issues here with the kind of good scientific procedures and the fact that the EU law might be an obstacle, or that the national law might be an obstacle to this. I mentioned very briefly previously that AI questions in general are mentioned in the new proposal, but that that it is too soon to say much on this at this point in time. And also given the large political discussion that is ongoing on the global level in WIPO and at the EU level at this point in time. So for me, it makes sense perhaps to not introduce new exceptions, also referring back to what EU Commissioner Breton said, that the provisions on text and data mining, if implemented in a good way at the national level, are well implemented, then they should be enough to cover the usages that we are envisioning for text and data mining at this point. A few of the issues that I still see with the new proposal for a revision of the TDM provisions in the Swedish Copyright Act. Again, it's a very narrow implementation of communication to the public. It solves two specific problems, and I think it's really good that these two problems are solved. But I think that there might be more, and I think that we need to hear more researchers' views on where are there actually needs to communicate works in the TDM process. Because I think that this is also an environment that is so rapidly emerging that it's hard for the legislator to understand what needs actually exist on the very practical level. And with two such very specific usages, I find it hard to believe that there wouldn't be additional usages that we block with this very narrow exception. So I think that the best thing would be to implement a verbatim introduction of Article 5.3a in InfoSoc. This is perhaps very nerdy and hard to understand for most, but there is a broad and functioning exception for communication to the public for scientific researchers in the InfoSoc directive that I mentioned previously that could be implemented in a direct way in Swedish law, as it has been done in Italy, in Slovenia, in several other countries across the European Union. I think that I might need to skip ahead a bit in order to also make sure that there is time for some discussion. But I again want to reiterate that I think that it's problematic that there are so few solutions for cross-border or digital use in this proposal. And I understand that it's hard for a Swedish legislator to solve cross-border usage within the European Union, but I think that we could have done more work to align the Swedish proposal with other national proposals in the European Union to at least enable cross-border usage between those countries, as that could also potentially push towards the European Union and the European Commission to look into European-wide solutions on cross-border usage. And again, like several of the things that I have mentioned are also revisited, like restated in the AI Act. So the 0.something% of the AI Act that revolves around copyright mostly refer directly back to the copyright in the Digital Single Market Directive, which puts the CDSM directive in an even more central position when it comes to copyright around AI in the European Union. And this recital 61. In these recitals, the AI Act states that it realizes that general purpose AI models might present both opportunities for innovation and challenges for rights holders. So this is mostly a reminder, of course, to something that I think has become obvious for most actors in the field. It reiterates that TDM is used exactly to develop these models. So mirroring what I just said and as quoted from Commissioner Breton as well. But it also reiterates that you need to make sure that you have legal or lawful access to the material that you use, either through a license or authorization from the rights holders, or through the TDM exceptions that we have now in the law. So there are a few recitals that just kind of reiterates standard common copyright concepts, and as well, of course, the rights for right holders to opt out from the general TDM use. This is, as I mentioned, just kind of repeating common insights as the recitals in the EU acts typically do, and don't really introduce any new requirements or legal requirements on users of TDM. So the new things that we see in the AI Act that could be relevant from a copyright perspective is partly the transparency requirements on all providers of general purpose AI models, according to which they need to draw up a sufficiently detailed summary of the content that has been used for training the general purpose AI model. And this summary needs to be generally comprehensive rather than technically detailed. And for me, I think this is a relatively good compromise, as it kind of ensures that naming and sourcing requirements are upheld and that rights holders gain credit for the usage of their works, while innovation is not hindered more than necessary. So for all general purpose AI models, there is, when the AI Act is finally approved by the European Council, then there is a need for all general purpose AI models to develop this generally comprehensive summary of the works that have been used to train the model. And finally, the general purpose AI models need to put in place policies to respect the European Union copyright law, and especially on how they work with the opt-out clause in the general TDM exception. So these two new requirements on AI models are only applicable on general purpose AI models. So large models like the constantly debated ChatGPT, for example. So they need to present to the AI Office of the European Union a policy where they describe how they aim to work with making sure that they respect the reservations of rights that are expressed according to the Article 4.3 in the EU directive, or the CDSM directive. So I think that makes it 45 minutes, and I'll try to stop there to make sure that there is some time for any questions and thoughts or whatever it could be. Thanks for your patience and for listening, and I hope everything was clear enough for those with little previous knowledge, and not too matter-of-factly for those who have much previous knowledge. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Eric. Very interesting. And now we have some time for questions and reflections. We have one question on the chat from Alexander Kasenkov. If you would like to check the chat, Eric.
Yes, sure. I'm just reading the question as we speak. Yeah, I think that's a really, really good question, Alexander. And I mean, there's an intense conversation going on, I'd say, at all levels, and of course, being coordinated between all those levels. So there's an intense discussion going on at the WIPO level, at the WTO level, at the European level, between different regional actors, and of course, between the European Union and all the member states, to kind of develop best practices and guidelines on how to kind of solve the balance that also the AI Act kind of reiterates in one of the recitals that I just mentioned, to find a balance between the need for innovation on the one hand, like not hindering innovation, and at the same time respecting the rights of the rights holders. So when we should start to expect effective enforcement, that's a splendid question. It would be interesting to hear more your thoughts on like DMCA in relation to this, because of course, I mean, it will take the DMCA has quite a few years on its how do you say on its it has some history at this point. It's a few years old, so there has been time to also start to look into law enforcement of the DMCA. I expect that there will be law enforcement of both the CDSM directive and the AI Act when it's finally approved by the Council. So will probably take some time, but I think that this is something that will happen, across the world. And I like WIPO was looking into the recent court case in China on output and recent court developments in the United States on training of AI models on data and everything. So it's happening a bit ad hoc at all levels, at all times, but also with a very close collaboration between global and regional actors. I hope that kind of makes sense as some kind of answer. I think it's difficult to say, an exact date or something.
Okay, thank you very much. Then Cyril, you have raised your hand. Unmute yourself.
Yes, thank you for your insights. So it seems to be fairly clear that you cannot just crawl the web and get data for training your model, but OpenAI is making billions and no lawsuit has come to an end yet against them. So is there anything going to happen against these big companies that just take code or text that we've published without any acknowledgement, and they just make money on the work that others have done and without having a license to access what they access?
Yeah, I think this is a great question, Cyril. And I mean, I work for the Wikimedia movement, which hosts the Wikipedia platforms that are one of the largest sources, perhaps, for information and for like data needed for the general purpose AI models. And I think this is very tricky, but it will obviously become easier when Poland was the last country to implement the CDSM directive a few weeks back, and now we are looking towards probable approval from the EU Council during the spring of the AI Act that has some additional provisions on exactly the things that you're mentioning. And when we have this kind of need for a sufficiently detailed summary of the material that has been trained on, if the general purpose AI models fail to comply with this requirement, then of course the EU Commission will likely give them some heavy fines. And if they do acknowledge the sources according to the requirements in the AI Act, then on the other hand, it will be quite clear, what kind of material that they have used. And I think that in this regard, the GS Media court case from the European Union from 2016, I think, is quite important, which was a court case that explicitly mentioned that it's also illegal to link to material that is illegally available on the internet. So it's obviously illegal to host copyright infringing material on the internet. But from the GS Media court case, it also states clearly that it's illegal to also link to material that is illegally available on the internet. And I again think that there is an analogy here, between the GS Media case and the lawful access to internet material that is required according to the TDM provisions. But eventually it will be a question for the Court of Justice of the European Union, right, to define to what length is the TDM developer or AI developer needed to go to ensure that they know that the material that they are using to train the models are legally available on the internet. Because if you work with, I don't know, millions of data or files or media or whatever it could be, then it will be very hard to put down for every single, or to know for every single item that is used if it's legally available or not. So I suppose that there will be some kind of balance, if it or proportion, if it's a minuscule part of the data that is legally not available, then it might be okay. But if it shows that a substantial amount of the information is copyright infringing in those models, then that might be basis for a fine. But this is just me, thinking and This is, of course, not the final response from the Court of Justice of the European Union.
Thanks.
Okay, we have an additional question from Simin, please.
Thank you. Nice talk, Eric. I was intrigued by your first slide where you input data and voices and images and so on, and you get new voices, images, data, and, well, not data, but suggestions and decisions. So that intrigued me. I see that a lot of this legislation you're covering is really what you can make money out of, right? On the right-hand side, it's new images, maybe new images or new text and so on, which is what OpenAI is making money out of. But what about suggestions and decisions? I mean, also, I think it applies to all of them, because tracing what is in the new on the right-hand side to what was fed in the left-hand side is very difficult, even if they were willing and there were law enforcement to do it. It's very difficult because how to trace is technically not solved, as far as I understand. And the question is, if decisions and suggestions would be traced, it would amount to some kind of explainability of those decisions. And these are unsolved problems. So how can the gap between the technical feasibility and law wishes by legal enforcement be reconciled? This is my question after your talk.
Thanks, Simon. I think that's a great question, and maybe like the first thing to say is that, of course, like we think of AI as ChatGPT as like equaling, you know, those large general purpose AI models that are so much used like right now, but AI is so much more, right? I mean, we have like so many sector specific AI applications, like things that are used in quite niche in like municipalities start to use AI for very specific decision-making procedures, or I envision that like it will be very useful in law, you know, certain AI kind of applications. So it's like from the, you know, large general purpose AI models, which is maybe what we think a lot about when we think about AI today, but it's also the very like sector specific or niche AI models that we see, and maybe the decisions and the suggestions are kind of more relevant for the more sector specific AI models rather than the general purpose AI models. But besides from that, I think that it's also, if we go back to the general purpose AI models, then I think to a certain extent that if you can trace the output back to the input, then that's a failure of the model as well, right? Like if you want to have, for image generation, for example, if you can track from the output, like from the created image, like back to an original image. I mean, that's what they are trying in this China, in this AI case in China. If that then is copyright infringement, and of course it could be if you can see that it's an obvious correlation between the image that has been inputted and the image that is outputted, then that there is I think a valid claim for copyright infringement. So like I suppose that the goal for ChatGPT and others is to have enough image data so that it will be even more difficult to find the direct correlation between the image and the like the image that is created and the images that have been used for creating the model. So I think that traceability might be very important in some applications of AI. Like, for example, if you have niche sector-specific AI models that might be in law, or I mean, where you want to see the kind of the procedure, where you want to see the process. Whereas for the general purpose AI models, it might be even the other way around. That it might be, you know, that you don't want to be able to trace the output back to the input, because then that shows that you haven't had enough media data, like for training the model. Does that make sense?
Yes, I think it does. Of course, the question is how, if you were going to court or law and saying that somebody used my text or image or whatever to produce the right-hand side, then how could you actually win that case? because there's only two, I mean, I'm not a law person, I'm a computer scientist, but as far as I can see, there's only two ways of being able to convict someone using your data or text or whatever, either by requiring that every AI company declares what are their sources and be publicly declare that, or trace it. And if you say the trace part doesn't hold for many of those applications, well, then my question after this, listening to this talk, becomes, how is these laws ever going to be winning any court cases? But that's because I don't know how law works.
No, I think you pinpoint an important question, and that's also, I think, why we have this kind of requirement in the AI Act for sufficiently detailed summaries, so that there is some possibility to trace at least what general sources have been used. But I think that we will see more like winning court cases on the only input side, like on how material can be used for training the models, rather than this kind of traceability, because as the models will become better and trained on more data, then it will be more difficult to kind of find to trace the output back to the input. But this is, just me reading reports and articles and trying to find analogies and not of course, evident truth.
Thank you.
Okay, everyone. Thank you very much for your reflections and questions. I think the time is now 11 a.m. Thank you very much, Eric, for having performed this presentation. Very interesting. And for all of you still present, please stay tuned for equally interesting and upcoming webinars. You will find all our coming webinars in the calendar on our website. Having said this, I would like to thank you for your attention and wish you all a continuously pleasant week and a happy Easter for those of you who celebrate Easter. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.